Okay, hello. Welcome everybody. It's 1 minute past the hour, so let's get started. So nice to see participation from all over the world once again. My name is Sarah. I work at FOS Europe with communications and with information design, and I am honored to kick off this second webinar about design and management of networks of marine protected areas. We've been working on this for quite some time, so we're really happy to be able to share it now, and we really hope that it will be useful for everyone working with MPA networks all around the world. Today, you will be taken on a quick tour of a new framework and a 10-step method for tackling some of the big challenges in marine protection. And to guide you along the way, we have a set of amazing panelists from Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Australia to match the spread of attendees as well in this webinar. As a reminder, this is the second webinar of 3, but all 3 will have the same agenda. So we walked through these same things last week, and we will do the same again next week on Thursday with a bit of a change in the lineup of speakers. So that means that you don't need to attend more than 1 webinar, but of course you are more than welcome to do so if you want to get a deeper understanding of these subjects or just to have fun with us once again. A couple of housekeeping matters. For questions, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can type your questions, and Ilka and Annette will be monitoring there and answering questions in that box. Please use that function as far as you can. We do have a lot to get through, but there will be some time here and there to take live questions as well. And we will also have some questions for you, the audience, every once in a while. So you'll see a poll pop up on your screen in some of the breaks between the different presentations. If you have a thought that you'd like to share with everyone that's not a question, then you can use a chat for that. We are recording this webinar, and after the last webinar of the series of 3, we will email you a link to one of the recordings so that you can watch it again and again and again. And if you would like to know more, you can find a web article and the full report on our website, and I'll put the link in the chat in a moment. Meanwhile, our first panelist is Jenny Hertzman. Jenny is an expert on marine protection. She's worked for some years with the framework at a regional level in the County Administrative Board of Blekinge, and now she is representing the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. Take it away, Jenny.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah. Do you see my screen well now? Yes, good. Thank you. I'll just put on the pointer as well. So thank you for that introduction, Sarah. And I'm very happy to be here with you today and be able to give you a small introduction and a bit of background to this large work that we've done in Sweden. My name is Jenny Hertzman and I work at SWAM, the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. We work directly under the government, a national authority, and we are responsible for the management of aquatic resources, both freshwater and marine ones. So we need to make sure that we protect sufficient marine areas. We have to make sure that the marine resources are sustainably used, and we also have to make sure that the management is going well. Within our agency, I also would like to mention that we have marine spatial planning and we have fish and fisheries management within the same authority, which can have some bearing on this work. So why do we have this work? Why do we do this in Sweden? It's our international commitments that I guess many of you also recognize pretty well. We have the CBD, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Aichi targets, mainly target number 11 that you might recognize that says more or less this. an effectively managed, ecologically representative, well-connected and functional network of formally protected marine areas that covers at least 10% of Swedish marine waters. I think you recognize this, and we have worked a lot with this area of protection, formal protection. Here we talked about 10% when we started this work. Now we are talking about scaling up to the 30%, as you might be aware of. But I also want to emphasize that we work a lot with those other qualitative aspects of the MPAs and the network. What do we mean really with efficiency, with functionality? What is effectively managed? What is representativity? What is connectivity? All those nice fluffy words. How do we make anything concrete out of this? How can we see that this is really a functional MPA network? From the government, my agency got an assignment in 2015 where we needed to do an analysis to see if the then existing network of MPAs were good, were doing well, were really fulfilling the purpose of it. But we found out in our analysis that the representativity was uneven. The distribution of MPAs over Sweden was also uneven. And what about the effectiveness? When we look at Sweden, we can divide Sweden into 3 sub-marine regions, you could say. We have the West Coast, where we in 2016 had more than 20% of marine areas protected. We then have the Baltic proper and the Gulf of Bothnia, that is the north of the Baltic, where we had less than 10% in each sub-region. In total, 6.6%. So we didn't reach the 10%. And you can see that there was a big uneven distribution of the then existing MPAs. And when we look at representativity, we could divide the sea into deep bottoms, soft and hard, and to shallow bottoms, soft and hard. And we can see that here we didn't have a good representativity either. I mean, the deep bottoms were not protected to a large extent, and the soft bottoms were more protected, but still it was not a good representativity all over the different kinds of bottoms and depth that we had. This is from 2016 as well. And what about the effectiveness? We didn't have any tool at all to really judge and understand if we had an effective MPA network or not. I mean, there is a lot of questions, as you probably know, about this. Is it only paper parks that makes no difference in reality? But here we really needed to find out, how do we really prove or show or understand if our network is effective or not? If it's not effective, we shouldn't invest more resources into the MPA networks. So we really needed to go from vision to national action plan. And there we identified 5 different areas of actions. We needed more MPAs. We needed stronger protection. We also needed a national framework where we had the processes, the definitions, and the concepts all gathered. We also needed an evidence-based, and we needed to work with adaptive management. The key thing here is the national framework, where we gather all the rest. We can enable all the other activities to happen within the framework. So it is about the framework that we will focus today and tell you a little bit about how we worked, even though we can talk for days, I guess. So we started to work with this Swedish national framework for an MPA network for design and management. And I really want to emphasize the network part. We are not talking about individual MPAs. We talk about the whole network, how it could work together and be more resilient in a more overarching view, a more holistic perspective. This assignment was led by my agency, SWAM, the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, but in extremely close collaboration with the coastal county administrative boards bordering the Baltic Sea and the north of the Gulf of Bothnia. The whole process was also led by FOS Europe, that are experts in the method conservation standards that we used throughout this whole work. So there were a lot of people leading this process, working tightly together, which is one of the success factors of this work, I would say. We didn't want to invent the wheel again, and we do have some experiences and knowledge in Sweden as well. We have a national park, we have collaboration plans working with archipelagos, and we have a very well developed strategy for management of marine areas on the West Coast. So we try to build the whole framework on the existing experience and knowledges that we do have in Sweden. And what is then a framework? The word framework might be a bit strange to some people, but it's nothing special. It sets the frames, it describes the concepts, the guiding principles, the structure and the theory of change of what we want to obtain. Together with the framework, we also developed a method, a step-by-step process, like a recipe where you can follow each step and understand how you could do to implement the framework and work with it. We tried that method out also in our regional plans. For the Gulf of Bothnia and for the Baltic proper, we tried to use this step-by-step method, and at the same time we twisted and developed the framework. So this was done in a very parallel process. Now we are also working with West Coast to get a similar regional plan for that marine region as well. I also want to mention the dashboard. The dashboard is where we gather all the data of marine protection, and where we also have a very visual way to show where we have our protection and where our largest gaps or needs are. This is to make sure for everyone involved, but not at least the decision makers, to understand what we need to prioritize. Where do we need to put our efforts? All those three parts were developed in a very parallel process. Now it's of course stuck. Let's see if it works now. Sorry. Do you see my next slide now? Perfect, good, excellent. So this is not done in 1 year or 1 month. We have been working pretty hard in a large process, starting with the first workshop in 2017, going on all the way. We still have more workshops to come, 1 in 2 weeks. So it's an ongoing work here with all the cabs. And it's been a really participatory process. More than 60 people have been involved in this. And we have all the 3 products, or what you would say, that we developed in a close collaboration with the cabs. So I will end here, and thank you very much for listening, and I will hand over to Sarah. I hope you will enjoy the rest of the seminar. I will stop sharing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Excellent introduction today. I think we don't have any questions come in yet. I'll remind attendees, if you do have questions, we have a questions and answers Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window that you can use for that. And meanwhile, we have a question for you at this point. So I will start a little poll. You will see a question and some options for answering now. To reply, the question is, does your country or region have an ambition for establishing or improving its MPA networks? Okay, so I would say this looks quite promising. Almost everyone said yes. And we have some to some extent, and some don't know, and one no also. One country or region that does not have these ambitions, at least yet. Okay, with that, thank you for those answers. This is interesting for us to know as well. With that, we move on to our next panelist, which is Ilka Tilders. Ilka is co-director of FOS Europe, and she is an expert in adaptive conservation management. And her role in the work presented here today was that of team lead. So she was leading the development of the framework and the methodology. Take it away, Ilka.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you all see my screen? Is that working? Okay. And thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I have a couple of minutes to introduce to you, let's say, the overarching framework that we've developed and give you a bit of a tour in the main steps of the methodology. It is a lot in a hurry, so I made a selection. Don't worry, I won't tell you the entire story. I guess the first thing to underline is really important. It is our first attempt, our first draft of an emerging framework and methodology. It builds on, as Jenny explained, on what we think the most practical concepts that are out there. And we integrated much of the wisdom that perhaps many of you have also contributed to over the years. And this is where we landed. We don't think it's perfect, but it kind of like did the trick to make a good start in Sweden. We started with really defining some of the main criteria for this network. And as Jenny introduced it, ecological representativity, well-connected, functioning, and effectively managed. And that 10% seemed to be the key criteria that we were tasked to try and wrap our heads around. Those key definitions then helped us to really tease out the components that are needed in this framework to develop together. But as you can imagine, there were many issues along the way that we needed to tackle, and we framed them in guiding principles, principles that we all now use and apply when applying this framework. The time that we invested in defining these key terms and these criteria was really well used because it formed our common language. And without this common language, it's really difficult for a large group of specialists to wrap their heads around something. I can really advise you, if you ever go this way, to invest that time. To give you a few examples, one of the key components was the term ecological representativity. And we landed together after a lot of debate on the definition: a representative marine protected area network encompasses geographically well distributed, relevant proportions of the full range of ecosystems and ecosystem components that occur in the marine region. So the geographically well distributed is really important. Relevant proportions of the full range is also important. And that led us to believe that actually what we're after, in terms of components, what we need to define is a list of species and habitats that we're trying to conserve with this marine protection network. But also what we are in need of is to really define the proportion of targets that should be protected. We call those protection objectives. Another example, the term effective management, also one of the key criteria of this challenge. And we landed on the definition, and there's a lot of debate about this worldwide, but we landed on the definition: an MPA network is effectively managed if its ecological targets are sufficiently protected, if the negative effects of human activities are reduced, and if favorable conservation status of the targets is achieved. And this led us to tease out the components of: we need to have a good understanding of the human activities that negatively impact these targets and the sensitivity of our targets to these threats. We need to understand then how much human activity should be reduced. We call those threat reduction objectives. And we need to tease out how stringent the regulation needs to be in order to reach those threat reduction objectives. We call those regulation objectives. There are many more definitions. I don't have time to introduce them all to you, but you can read them in the guidance if of interest to you. And what we did with this definition and the components that we teased out is we used a theory of change to wrap our heads around how these different components are supposed to relate to each other. And on the simplest level, the theory of change for the Marine Protected Area Network, we shaped like this. All the way to the left, we start. If there is sufficient protection, then harmful human activity is reduced or avoided, and the status of key marine habitats and species is restored and maintained. It's a very simple theory of change. If you protect enough of the right stuff in the right places against human activity that is a priority and impacts, then nature is going to do better. It's the theory of change behind the Marine Protected Area Network. And it's, of course, a limited view, because it's not talking about the context in which marine protected areas function in the wider context of integrated marine management. We kept it rather simple because that is what we could intellectually tackle in this phase of development. We then tied the different components to this theory of change. So you can see that the protection objectives are how much of what you protect, and the regulation objectives, how stringent the regulation is, all has to do with sufficient protection, etc., etc. You can see the main components being tied to this framework. The color coding kind of like helps you understand the relationships, but you can also see here an emergence of steps. And it is these steps that we try to filter out and give back to the conservation community, the marine conservation community, as kind of like the 10 steps that we in Sweden took. They are presented to you as a step 1, step 2, as if they're really linear. In actual, they're not that linear. They are very iterative. And we try to have a pretty logical flow, but I must say that some of these steps at the back of the process are actually also at the beginning of the process. But this is more or less how it goes. The good first step is to assemble a relevant team with the right skills and representation of the Marine Protected Area Network that you're trying to create. Step 2 is to delineate the marine region that you're really talking about and to create a vision, articulate a vision together with the relevant people for this marine region. The next step would be to define what it is you're actually trying to protect and set goals for these. Step number 4, trying to articulate, given the status of today, what is reasonable, how do you want them to look like in 30 years from now? In conjunction with that, look at what does that mean for the protection? How much of that do we need to protect? In conjunction with that, what are the main threats and what is the sensitivity of these targets to these main threats? And what does that then mean for the regulation objectives? I must say that the understanding of threats, of course, also has a bearing on the protection objectives. So this goes both ways. Along the way, you build your evidence base, meaning to say you kind of like assemble all the best available knowledge to try and put as much knowledge underneath how much we have of what the status currently is, how much is protected currently, what the real threats are, how bad these threats are if they occur inside marine protected areas, etc., etc. That evidence base then is the basis for formulating priority actions, and along the way you structure your adaptive management process and the governance structure of your marine protected area network, which basically means you try and wrap your head around who decides how often, on the basis of what data and what kind of questions together. That is a lot in a hurry. Annette is going to explain to you, going to zoom in on a couple of components of these steps. So, for example, the nested targets, goals, and protection objectives. And afterwards, Lotta is going to take you to understand a bit better what we mean with this threats and sensitivity, the threat reduction and regulation objectives. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these last 3 steps. So bear with us and you get a bit more introduction. That's it from my side. Back to you, Sarah.
Lovely. Thank you, Ilke. So we start zooming in. And to help us do that, we have Annette Olsson, who is a biologist. She's based in Denmark and she works for FOS Europe. And she's been a part of the team that has worked on the framework and also worked a lot on the dashboard, which we will see more about later on. Go ahead, Annette.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks, Ilke, for the introduction. And yeah, let's have a little bit of a closer look at some of these steps that Ilke just outlined for you. One of the first steps that we went through was to define the boundaries, or what we call the geographical scope for the work, and also to set a common vision for everybody involved. For a start, the vision was quite clear and straightforward, that we would have a network or networks of MPAs that ensures the protection of all living creatures and biological features for the current and future generations. Then moving on to the scope, which is the area of focus for the framework, and Jenny also mentioned this briefly earlier. The scope here covers all of Sweden's marine water. However, we divided it into 3 regions that you can see here on the map, each forming its own MPA network. So the regions are delineated through the marine spatial planning process, and it had already happened, and it made a lot of sense for us to use that. And it's reflecting the difference in the environment there, for example, salinity, the biodiversity, and the level of and types of pressures. So for example, the Gulf of Bothnia in the northern Baltic, which is the turquoise color on the map, is home to a series of very unique species that are well adapted to the low salinity that is found there. While on the other hand, the area of Vesterhavet on the west coast in the dark blue color on the map have a much higher level of salinity and a different and higher level of biodiversity. So those were the 3 regions we are working with. So after we have identified those, the next step was to identify the ecological systems, the habitats and the species that we're going to focus on, and that's important to protect. And there are many, so we went through a process to identify those. As a start, it made sense for us to look at the distinction between the depths, so the shallow and the deep areas, and also the different substrates, so the soft substrate bottoms or the hard substrate bottoms that Jenny outlined earlier. And these units we call targets. And the idea here is that the conservation of the target should, in theory, ensure the conservation of all the different ecosystems and species within our scope. Apart from the 4 targets that are related to the depths and the substrate, there was an additional target needed, and we added one here as areas of particular importance for seabirds and marine mammals. So we have 5 targets. For each of these 5 targets, we then made a more detailed selection of the ecosystem components that we aim to protect. And these we call nested targets. And the team spent quite a lot of time on developing and agreeing on this list, because it's quite important, as much of the design of the MPA network is really anchored in this list of nested targets. So we used a few guideline principles for the selection of these targets. And as I said, there are potentially many, but we made a decision to cap it at around 50, else it will just be too overwhelming and unmanageable to work with. And I believe we ended up with 48 nested targets. We also assumed that by protecting a habitat or an ecosystem, that the species within it is also protected. So therefore, most of our nested targets are habitats or ecosystems. And finally, we were basing the list on existing priorities and legal commitments that Sweden has. So following European, regional and national list of prioritized ecosystem components. And as far as possible, also using the names that are already existing for these different habitats and species. Made it easier to work with. So once we have our list of nested targets, the next step was then to assess what is the current health status of these nested targets now. and then to set goals for them to see what we want to achieve with their status over time. So how do we want them to be maintained or improved if they are in poor status? This table here shows the status for just a few of the nested targets from 2 of the regions. The status was set by regional experts. They are, however, based on other information that we had from, for example, Natura 2000 and the Red List, but then adding the experts' own knowledge from that particular region that they were working with. We also decided to adopt the concept of favorable conservation status for the nested targets, as many of these protection conventions and agreements are using this or very similar concepts. And that really enabled us to compile and use this information from already existing assessments such as IUCN or HELCOM. Once we have estimated the current health status of the nested targets, then we were able to set goals for each of them that express what the desired future status of a given nested target is. We defined generic goals for each of the nested targets across the MPA networks, which could then be adopted by each MPA that you can see here, an example of a generic goal. Then also each region and each county within the region can then develop a more specific goal for each of the nested targets, like the example we have here for blue mussel beds in Blekinge County. Now you'll see the X in there, and the X in this specific goal, so the how much to ensure the protection of, is really relevant for the parallel step where we formulate protection objectives. And formulating protection objectives is where we determine how much of both the marine waters in general, so nationally, but also in each of the marine regions, should be under protection, and how much of each nested target we aim to protect. And this is the piece that then will inform the X in the specific goal. We developed 2 types of protection objectives. The general one for the marine waters nationally and in each region. So here you see the 10% that was mentioned earlier to be scaled up to 30% over time, as well as specific ones for nested targets, which we'll have a look at shortly. So these protection objectives are key to reaching the ecological representativity that Ilke mentioned earlier. And this is because it is through these that we aim for this sufficient proportion of each nested target to be protected throughout the networks. And it's also one of the tools we use for then assessing the effectiveness of the network. So are we achieving what we want to achieve with them? It was not straightforward to develop these protection objectives for the nested targets, as we assumed that each of them need different levels of protection in each region, with those 3 marine regions being different. To identify the need for this protection and to help us set suitable objectives, we used 3 different criteria. So the current occurrence, the conservation status, and the biological value. And we sort of scored each of the nested targets against these criteria. So as you can see in the table here, for example, the more the nested target occurs in a particular region, the smaller the proportion that needs to be protected and the lower the score. The better the conservation status is of that nested target, the smaller the proportion that needs to be protected. And again, a lower score. But then the higher the biodiversity of the nested target, so the more species that live in or depend on that nested target, the more important it is for the ecosystem functioning. And the higher the score, the more that needs to be protected, and the higher the score for this. So an example of this here is of coastal lagoons in the Gulf of Bothnia. As you can see on the table here, the coastal lagoons are relatively common, so they get a score of 2. Their conservation status is poor, however, so it's getting a score of 3. And the biological value is very high, so they score 4 for this, giving a weighted average of 3.3. We have weighted the biological value here higher than the other 2 criteria. So for the framework, we developed 4 protection objective levels expressing different amounts of suggested protection. And the higher the weighted average is for a given nested target, the more we suggest is placed under protection to ensure that the goal for that nested target can be reached. So for the coastal lagoon example here, which had a weighted average of 3.3, it is therefore put in that bracket there where we recommend that minimum 50% of that nested target is put under protection in the Gulf of Bothnia. That was it for me. I am gonna pass it over to Lotte, who's gonna talk you through the threats and pressures component. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. While Lotta is setting up, I will briefly introduce her as well. Lotta Nygård is a marine biologist who lives in the high coast World Heritage Site area of Sweden. And she works with protection and management of marine areas at the County Administrative Board, or the CAB, of Västernorrland. Take it away, Lotta.
So, sorry, I realized I have to unmute myself as well. Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Annette. My name is Lotta Nygård, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about threats, because it's not, to get an efficient network, it's not only important to talk about to protect the right things at the right places and right amount of it. We also have to know what are the different threats to those things that we try to protect. What are threatening them? And what kind of threats do we need to reduce to get an efficient network? And in what way do they affect our different targets, nested targets? Through which stresses do they affect? And how sensitive are the different nested targets to the different threats and stresses? What are the main causes? So to be able to do this, we had to do a big mapping, you can say, of the different threats and what are causing the big effects at our nested targets. Yes, this is just to give you an example. Here you have one threat, and in this case it's dumping. It could be dumping of, for example, dredged material. And dumping is causing these different stresses. Altogether, we have identified 25 different threats and 13 different stresses. And one important part of this work was also to define what do we mean with each of these threats. What do we include and what do we not include? Because we realized that people mean different things with different words. So this was an important step to get a good, efficient management. If you can't get that if you don't mean the same thing. So we did a threat definition of each and also definitions of each stresses. One stress here can be caused by different threats. Important to say. We used the existing definitions, terminology as far as possible, and these are some of the definitions we used from different parts. In some cases, these they say the same, always different, and in some cases they differ. So we had to define what do we need in Sweden, what definition shall we go with? Yes, and this is something that we of course did together with all the counties in Sweden. It's important to get everyone on board to talk the same language, mean the same things. This is another example. Here you have 3 different threats. You have structures in water, you have dumping, and cables and pipelines. These threats are causing these different stresses. And here you see that some of the stresses are the same, but they are caused by different threats. And for each of these threats, we have a definition. What do we mean? What do we include in this one? And the same for all the stresses. The threats, they occur all over the landscape, or maybe a seascape, you should say. Here are some examples. Some of the threats, they are like widespread all over the place, and some other threats, they are intense but in small areas. So they differ in that way. But they also differ that the nested targets, they are different sensitive to the different threats and stresses. Some can be really sensitive to some stress and threats, and some others not. So what we had to do was to do an extensive sensitivity analysis. What are all these different nested targets sensitive to, and how sensitive are they? I'll show you one example, but this is just a tiny bit of this massive matrix we made. In this case, you have one threat, it's structures in water. You have it to the left. And then this threat is causing these different stresses. And to the right on the top, you have some examples of nested targets. In this case, sandbanks, estuaries, and meadows of vascular plants. And then you have a color mapping of sensitivity. And for those that have worked with Miradi before, you recognize the coloring. They stand for low, medium, high, and very high sensitivity, in red in this case. For each of the stresses, we have made a sensitivity analysis. How sensitive is, for example, sandbanks to physical loss? So for each of the stresses and combined with the nested targets, we have a sensitivity score. But you also have an overall score for the whole threat. For example, sandbanks is very high to sensitive to structures in water. So you have different stress sensitivity, and you have overall sensitivity to that threat. And this is the same as the Water Framework Directive, that the worst score set the overall score. So after we had done this step by mapping the different threats and how sensitive our nested targets are, we moved on to what can we actually do about this? What can we do to reduce the different threats? And what threats do we see that we have to reduce? Our tool to do this was to use regulations within our marine protected areas. What kind of regulation do we see that we need actually? The process behind this is quite complex, so we don't have time to go into it in detail, but I just mention that behind is the sensitivity score of a nested target. You have a conservation status of the nested targets, and also a precautionary approach. From this, we could set the objective for threat reduction. How do we want the threat to be reduced? And also objective for regulation. What do we want the regulation to say? I'll show you a few examples of this. But first, to get you an overall picture, we divided the different objectives into, you can say, 3 categories. The first one here is threat reduction objective. And the first category is sometimes we realize this is a really big threat. We don't want this to occur within our protected areas. So the first category says the human activity does not occur. The second one says human activity occurs to a limited degree, but with no negative impact. That's the case that sometimes we realize a threat is really harmful under certain conditions, but in others it's not. And the third category is that the human activity can occur. It's not that harmful. And accordingly, we have objectives for regulation as well. The top category says the human activity is prohibited. This is something that's so harmful, we don't want this to take place in our marine protected areas. The second one is human activity is restricted, and that could be a restriction in time or space. It could be that the nested target is sensitive certain times of a year, for example, during spawning times or something else. And the third category is that the human activity could be allowed. It's not that harmful. So a very short and straightforward example. I must say it's not always this case, but in this case we have an example of extraction of sand and stone. And the threat reduction objective says extraction of sand and stone does not occur in MPAs. We have realized it's so harmful, we don't want it in our marine protected areas. And the related objective for regulation is extraction of sand and stone is prohibited in all MPAs. So straightforward is so harmful, we don't want it. Another example, we don't go through all here, but just look at the bottom row. Here you have an example from the middle category. Extraction of sand and stone occurs to a limited degree, but with no negative impact in areas with seasonal ice in MPAs. So, to a limited degree. It could be under certain conditions okay, but otherwise it's not okay. The regulation of objective says special exceptions for extraction of sand and stone can be made in areas with seasonal ice in MPAs. Yes, so I know this was kind of rushed, but this is just to give you an overview idea of what we have done. So please feel free and ask questions in the chat or afterwards. You're more than welcome. But that's all for me. Thanks for now.
Thank you very much, Lotta. We have some questions coming in both in the chat, but also in this Q&A box, which is a little more, makes it a bit easier to follow the questions and answers if you use that. So we do encourage you to use that one instead. Next, I will hand it back to Ilke to tie this all together for us. I think you're muted, Ilke.
That helps probably. You can hear me a bit better.
It does. Thank you.
I was just expressing sympathy for our audience and being bombarded with all these concepts, but that's what it is. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to just flag a few things that we've done in the last 3 steps. And the first one is compiling the evidence base, and I would like to just give you a bit of a few pointers on how we thought about what we needed and what kind of best available evidence we need and on what grounds we judge if we have what we need. We actually started by going back to that theory of change that I introduced to you earlier. And we teased out the kind of management questions for each one of these components that we thought we needed to be able to answer. So for example, in relation to sufficient protection, is there enough protection of the right species and habitats in the right places? How much areas are protected? How much area? Etc., etc. And for each one of these components, we teased out a set of questions. I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can imagine the systematic way in which we try to go through this. For each of these questions, then, we detailed what are the data needs that come from these questions. So, for example, in order to answer the question, is there enough protection of the right species and habitats, we need to understand the proportion of marine region protection protected. We need to understand the proportion of each nested targets which is protected, etc., etc. Now you can imagine that the data needs and data availability, those are two different universes. So what we did is we tried to judge the data quality and also the data availability, and we used many different criteria for that, like validity, reliability, etc., etc. And they come with pretty strictly defined definitions. And using these definitions to every data set that we got our hands on and that we could use, and eventually which ended up in our national dashboard, led us to get a quality assessment score. And this quality assessment score can be either poor, which means there are insufficient or almost no available data. It can be fair, so based on only expert opinion, good, etc., etc. This helps us to kind of like understand from the data that we have in the dashboard, how confident are we in the use of these data? And the greener and the darker green it is, the more confident you can be about the data we use. We use these data for setting priority actions, for understanding where we are in relation to the objectives and the goals that we have formulated. So regulation, protection objectives, and the goals for future status of our listed targets and targets. And to set priorities on what do we need to invest in to increase our knowledge, because there are so many gaps in our knowledge, and there really are worldwide, of course, a lot of gaps. It's much more complex and harder than probably on land, on terrestrial ecosystems. To give you an idea, this is a snapshot of one of the dashboard views, and Annette Stewart is going to tell you much more and in a much better way what the dashboard is. But just to bring home a point, you see a view here of the dashboard. Zooming in on estuaries, you see the proportion that is currently protected. It's around 10%. You see that red line here, that orange line here, it's the protection objectives. It needs to be around 50%. So you see an enormous gap. It's that kind of information that we're trying to understand how far we are from, for example, our protection objectives. And sometimes we don't have data at all about how much we protect of something. It doesn't mean it's not protected, but we just don't know exactly. There's another set of information. Another example is you see another snapshot of the dashboard. Again, on this axis is the current area protected. These are the protection objectives. That gray zone is everything above it is you're protecting, you're meeting your protection objectives. Underneath it, you're not meeting your protection objectives. So it's interesting to see here, a few of these targets are in fair or in poor condition. They give you an idea of how important it is to increase your level of protection. But you also see here some targets which are fully protected, much more than our protection objective might have said, but they're still in very poor or poor condition. So it gives you information of where to look for, adjusting your regulation of protection. If you zoom in on, for example, these two that were fully protected, maybe there were sandbanks and estuaries. There was a big analysis of experts, and they explained why they are in poor condition. We also understand that, for example, for shipping, both these targets are very sensitive. The sensitivity is very high. And we know from our threats data that shipping is still occurring inside marine protected areas. That gives you kind of like a focus to look at the gap between your threat reduction objective, which is shipping shouldn't occur in your marine protected area, and what is really happening today. And that might mean that you need to revise your marine protected area regulation. Perhaps some of it is indeed not regulated in a particular marine protected area, or it means it is regulated, but it needs to be enforced better. And of course, there are many things that we keep running into that you cannot tackle on the level of a marine protected area, and things like eutrophication, regional fisheries, etc., etc. And this is and as we all know, the Achilles heel of marine protected areas if you don't do them in the context of integrated marine management. And so there are things you need to do outside, let's say, the toolbox of marine regulation, and that's what we're talking about here. Of course, the exercise that we did before, looking at the availability and the quality of data, also helps you understand what your priorities are for beefing up your evidence base, for setting data gathering priorities. And the general rule of thumb here to prioritize is to look for those nested targets which seem to be in trouble most, which we are at risk of losing most, and to really wrap our heads around that with a solid set of data. I'm going to move towards the last step of the guidance. And keep it. This is going to be really shallow because of the lack of time. I just would like to point out that we spent considerable time in thinking through our adaptive management processes. So we built our framework around the concept of adaptive management, which means, as we all know, systematically and periodically going through your data to really see if the data are telling you whether your key assumptions are coming through, and to evaluate the result and think through what can we do better, what can we adjust in the way we do things to have a bigger impact. And we base the way that we've designed this on the conservation standards. This is a framework designed by a global coalition of partners, the Conservation Measures Partnership, and the conservation standards is kind of like a global language and toolbox that is used by more and more partners. Many partners that I see here around the table are probably well aware of these conservation standards. Another part of the puzzle has been to really sincerely look into the governance structure. MPAs are governed by individual counties. Then there is a layer on national level, but that in-between level of regional management of networks, which involves the participation of many coastal counties bordering the marine region and the national level, that is something new. So we spend a lot of time on trying to imagine what that governance structure has been. This is not reality yet in Sweden, but it is something we are slowly trying to find our footing in. And we thought of developing 3 regional counties, aided by a national scientific committee to ensure the use of best available evidence. And those 3 regional counties then somehow report up to and inform the national priorities. And it's the national priorities, of course, that go to government and other agencies. So that was a lot in a hurry. I hope that we have been able to bring to life some of the main steps in this framework for you. I also understand it's a lot of theory, so I can imagine that it was a bit much to take in. Please feel free to look at the summary that we provided, and Sarah put a link in the chat. There's also a link to the full guidance materials, and feel free to share this with anyone in your region. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ilka. We have some good discussions going on in the Q&A box, some good questions coming in, and our panelists are hard at work replying to those questions. And there's some more comments there as well, some good discussion going on. Is there anything there that we would like to address now before we move on with a live answer? I think nothing at the moment. Well, while we have a think about that, I will launch the next poll. So after this very quick walkthrough of the framework and the method, we would like to know whether this can contribute to ongoing efforts in your country or region. So here is the poll.
There's, I don't know if there's time to highlight something in plenary, Sarah.
I think we do have time, yes.
We do. I think there's an excellent question by Lydia. Lydia is saying, yeah, isn't it clear enough that the threat reduction equals the regulation? And why do we need to articulate that so clearly in our planning? We have articulated in our planning because in many cases, and I don't think this is unique to Sweden, but in many cases, the very things that a conservation target is sensitive to, a human threat that it's sensitive to, is very obvious. So the threat reduction objective is very obvious, but the regulation objective is not always matching that reduction objective. So to make that very explicit, we made that step in between. And in the country where I'm from, there's a big difference between a protection and an effective protection, meaning to say that you're really protected against the things that it's sensitive to. So there's really a big gap between the two. I don't know if that answers your question, Lydia.
Great, thanks, Ilka. And again, in the Q&A, you can add more comments to those answers and questions. So there's a space for discussion there too. Okay, I will end the poll and share the results, and it looks very similar to the last one. Almost everyone thinks that this can be useful, at least to some extent, or more than that. This is very encouraging for us who have been working with this. We're so happy to see that it's inspiring people around the globe. Okay, moving on. Ilka already showed us a bit of a teaser about the dashboard and the data. And Annette Stewart will take us deeper into that. Annette is from Conservation Management in Australia. And she has experience in developing monitoring and evaluation systems. And she was part of this dashboard team which compiled the evidence-based base and created a dashboard for using and analyzing the data. Go ahead, Annette.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I'll just share my screen. So are you seeing that okay now? No?
No, yes.
Yes, through now. Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'll spend the next few minutes just walking you through the system that we built for the evidence base that Ilka just described. The main system, of course, is in Swedish, but I'll be using this English version to show you today. This introductory screen is repeating the image that's been in a few of the presentations so far, the theory of change, and then the questions around each part of that theory of change. And that was the structure for the team that I was part of, to go and find the data that would help us to answer these questions, really understand the quality of all that data, be aware of any gaps, but then put the data out there in a way that people can use. And over time, by using the data, the quality and the comprehensiveness of it would improve. I'll start with a fairly simple sort of overview page, which is just a summary of the whole MPA network. All of the pages have a series of charts that interact, and they're usually presented with this little theory of change image down in the bottom left, just to position the data for people using it, so they know which sort of questions this data is relevant to, what part of analysis it's relevant to. And we also show the quality and the source of that data. We're wanting people to use the data, but to understand the constraints around it as well. And then within each chart, there's pop-ups around how to use this, what the chart's saying, really trying to make it useful, but get the data used in the right context. This first chart here is just showing the total area that's protected in different types of MPAs. The table below is summarising that in number. The top right chart here is the protection level in each of the counties, the proportion relative to their total marine area. And then the bottom one is just breaking that out into the different types of protection mechanisms. And so you can drill in to see where are the Natura 2000 nature reserves that are in these counties for this proportion of the network. Drill into all sorts of things this way. You can focus in on a particular region. If we'd see the split of the protected areas in that region, can go right down onto the county level and see the split within a particular county. So the same information is made available to people operating in different parts of the network. So having a consistent sort of evidence base that's shared means people can be using and sharing and collaborating on interpreting all that data. The next page is just a sort of spatial example of that, the same data, but represented in a map. Again, the color coding is by type of protected area, and you can drill into particular regions, or you can go right on down and look at just one county if we just want to see what's the excuse me, the protection level in one county and what are their protected areas. So providing a lot of information, but in a consistent format to move around the system. It starts to make a bit more sense when we get down to the nested target level, because that's where we're starting to set those protection objectives that people have just talked about. So this is one of the regions, all the nested targets within it. As Ilka explained, the orange line is the protection objective, the level of protection we want to get to, whereas the blue is how much is protected now. So you can see estuaries are a fair way under their target, mudflaps are well protected right now. Hovering gives a whole lot more information about just what that target is, where the data is coming from. And then likewise, you can drill by different regions to see the different protection levels. And here you can see mudflaps aren't so well protected in this region. Can drill by targets as well, so different ways to slice and dice this data in ways that make sense to different people operating at different parts of the network and needing to make different analyses and different decisions. The data quality that we talked about earlier, this is an example of putting all this information into the dashboard so that it's accessible to people. These are all the nested targets, the ones we do and don't have data on, and then links off to the detailed quality assessments and the comments here. So it's pretty clear about what data is available or not, and what sort of quality that's at. Moving on to the threats area, so the middle proportion of the theory of change. This is listing out all the threats that were talked about earlier, showing the area that's threatened by those things, the ratings, different sort of levels of threat, and then this right-hand chart showing just what proportion of the MPA is impacted by those threats. So there's some that are really impacting the whole of MPAs. The bottom chart showing the areas outside of MPAs, and so you can see there's some threats that are just pervasive across the whole marine area. But drilling into the higher threats, the numbers come down, the areas come down, you start to get a bit more detail. And again, you can drill into that by region, by county, and starting to see here that the areas inside MPAs are better protected than those outside. Jumping along to the right-hand part of the theory of change, the nested targets and their status or their health. We combined data from a whole bunch of different sources to sort of get the best available that we could. Expert opinion from the regional management in the 2 regions, Natura 2000, IUCN Red List, all sorts of sources, and combine those to try to get a feel for what's the baseline we've got, what's the current health of these nested targets, and there's fair consistency across all those sources, but some gaps that are helpful to explore. Pulling that together in the chart that Ilka showed earlier is one that helps to drive analysis and decision making. So what this is showing is a bubble for each of the nested targets, coloured by how healthy it is, its status, poor, fair, good. And then the upright axis is saying how much is protected at the moment, and then what's the protection objective, how much do we want protected. So the picture that we're aiming for long term is that the targets are green, they're healthy, and they're sitting on or above the line in this grey area, meaning that their level of protection is equal to or greater than the objective that we've set. So with the position of things today, you can see where they're sitting. So ones that are up in the above the line and are not green, then the analysis is what do we need to do to turn that green? What threats are impacting on it? What regulations could be improved? How can we improve the health of those targets? The ones below the line, how do we turn those green as well? But also, how do we move them on up? How do we increase the level of protection over time? So a whole lot of data coming together into one visual that can be analysed by different people. Again, you can query on it by different regions, can look at them by different target types, so different ways of querying all of this information depending on the kinds of decisions that people are needing to make. So that's a whole lot of data coming through in one quick summary, but the tool is out there now, hoping that it will get more and more used over time, and that will start to increase the quantity of the data and the quality of the data as well. We've learned quite a bit through this process, so if you're thinking of doing a similar sort of thing in your own area, have a sort of a few tips for you. The first really is knowing what it is that you want to know. So having that theory of change and those management questions really helped us to zero in on just what data did we need, and what kind of analyses do we need to make, so that we can monitor and then plan and then monitor the growth and change in the network. The second is to use the data that you have. You'll never have all the data you want, it's just almost impossible. But use what you have, understand the quality, have some way to assess the quality and communicate that quality so that the people who are using the data can use it in the right context and make good use of it, and then know where the gaps are, and over time start to fill up some of those gaps. And the third is put it into some sort of tool like this. Don't have it sitting in big documents on shelves where people don't reference it. Try to get it into some sort of system that's interactive and visual, which sort of encourages sort of inquiry and makes the data more available and more useful, and that in turn produces the quality over time as well. So that's a quick summary through the system that we built. Thanks to, there's a few people on the call today that helped with this work. Thanks to all of those. It's a really fun job, and hoping that what we've created is useful for Sweden certainly, but people outside the network as well. So thanks, Sarah. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Annette. It's always great to see this. Do we have any questions at this point that we want to pick up live from the audience, or we leave that for the end? We have just a quick poll here. Sorry, go ahead, Annette.
No, I was just about to type an answer. I guess I can talk it out. Sarah was asking if there was going to be some progress reporting on the dashboard, and that this information is going to be used to track over changes over time. So yes, it will be updated with the newest information when that comes along. And as Rita will talk about, this will be used for the regional teams when they do their planning and plan for managing these areas in the best way. So that's how it's meant to work.
Great. Thanks, Annette. Before we move on to the last part, which is all about putting all of this into practice, we have a quick poll again. The question here is, you've just seen this dashboard, and the question is, how easy or difficult do you think it would be in your country or region to make this kind of complex information accessible in an interactive dashboard like this, and also to ensure that it is actually used in management decision making? Just in a couple of seconds, I will end the poll, and I would like to see a reaction or hear a reaction from you to these answers.
In the poll, how easy would it be to make the information accessible? And many say it would be difficult, and I think that that does not surprise me, because of a few things. Marine data are thin worldwide. And many countries face a huge gap, so that would be the first hurdle to take. And then one of the things that was hard for us in Sweden was also to get our hands on data sets that were stored with different, I don't know, institutes and agencies, and had different resolutions, were different quality, etc., etc. So I'm not surprised. It was difficult for Sweden as well. And I'm not surprised that others think it's complex too. Yeah.
I think one of the funny things is here that we started off trying to make just a prototype dashboard. That was the plan. But what we ended up with was the full functional thing. So it could be done, but it wasn't very easy.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last part of this this story is putting it into practice, and Rita B. Jönsson will help us walk through that. Rita is a marine biologist, and she coordinates the regional team and the plan for the Baltic proper region. She works both for SWAM and for the County Administrative Board of Kalmar. Go ahead, Rita.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And I hope you see my screen. I will give you a few words from the regional works in one of the marine regions in Sweden, and some words about how theory was put in practice. Let's see if I can change the picture. Yes, how theory was put in practice, and the process and the participation. Some words about the formal approval, and some words about future usefulness. And we have been working in the Baltic proper, as you see on the map at the right. And in this region, we have 7 county administrative boards with some responsibility for a given coastline. And a main initial task was to establish a team with these cabs together. And there were marine expertise from each cab. And I think we aimed at a more holistic approach on the Baltic Sea than we used to work. And I also think that the strong feelings, the beating heart for the severe situation in the Baltic Sea united us in this work. A strength was that the same work was done parallel in the region of Gulf of Bothnia. So I think we were 2 teams working together. And as you heard before, there has also been excellent work done at the West Coast, and teams have been working there before with a strategy. And this was also very good for us to rely on when we started our work. So we formed a vision in the Baltic proper, but I would also state that the vision, the national vision, that the vision for Baltic proper was a keystone in the national vision. We have to reach a good status in the Baltic proper to form a keystone of a healthy Swedish sea for current and future generations. As Ilke mentioned before, we spent a lot of time in identifying the nested targets unique for the Baltic proper, and quite a lot of time to find the relevant protection objectives for each nested targets. And you can see some examples here for the Baltic Sea. And a well-defined list of this is crucial for the future analysis of the network. And as you see, all this was also very important for the dashboard. So we think a lot of time can be spent to find the lists and align them. We followed the method, but as Ilke also said, it was really an iterative process. We went back and forth between many of the steps, and I think that this was very important also to rethink, to process new information, to refine our decisions. And sometimes new colleagues entered the group and the team, and we had to answer the questions again. This way of working has been really important to reach consensus, agreement on different lists, decisions, and so on. All the results and conclusions from these steps are summarized in regional plans for each region, and they contain description of the areas, the participation, the objectives and goals, priorities for future work. And we all see this as adaptive plans that we have to refine when new knowledge is available. The plans have now been formally approved by all cabs, and I think that is the joint work we have done, the holistic approach, and the feeling of built this work together has made it quite smooth or straightforward for approval. And the governors for the administrative boards have signed the approval, and I think this is really a strength for the future work. And the next steps, I would say that we have already taken some next steps. We are working together now with monitoring and effective management. And we see that the teams are growing. More colleagues are joining with other skills and experiences that we need in this work. So that's very, very nice to see. And we also see that this work are very important for future communication, both in Sweden, but also as the questions here, together with other countries around the Baltic. And we think it's a very important plans as bridges between other processes going on in Sweden, like, for example, marine spatial planning, marine framework directive, and green infrastructure. So finally, just to give you some, final words about the work that we have done. We, in Sweden, and perhaps also in your countries, there is still gaps in marine knowledge, available data and so on. And we applied the motto that perfect is the enemy of the good. We have to work with the data that is available, as Annette said, with the dashboard. Use what is available and refine when we have new knowledge. So we try to reach good enough under these circumstances. We still know quite a lot about the ocean still, and that we have to use. So, and finally, there is many different kind of results as you have seen during these presentations. But I would also say that the process itself is an important result. The teamwork, the meetings, and we use the teamwork for very long. And I think that is a very nice process to evolve. And so I would say thank you, FOS and SWAM, for making this happen. And thank you all for the attention. And over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Rita. We have 5 minutes left for final questions, final comments. There was one question that's just coming in. Ilka, do you want to take that live, or you want to type it?
Yeah, Lydia has a good question. She thinks, she is asking, do you think the fact of having 3 regional MPAs plays a decisive role in the success of your endeavor? What if you had to work with many rather small heterogeneous MPAs, like the situation we face in Greece? Rita, would you like to answer this one? You're muted, yeah.
Yes, I know. Thank you. Difficult questions. I'm not really aware of the situation in Greece, but it depends on how large teams and so on. I think just having all the work very transparent and try to reach this feeling of a teamwork together is very important. I'm not sure how many different scales there can be, but yeah. Anyone who want to add some answer?
Rita, could you give an idea how many marine protected areas does for example, the Baltic proper entail, more or less? Because there, all in all, there are 100, I think, in Sweden.
Yes, all in all, is 100 at the moment. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm. I could maybe add also to that, as I worked in the Cabo Blekinge, which is bordering where Rita is working, the county of Kalmar, and we've both been working there for over 10 years. But it's this work that really initiated the good teamwork and collaboration between our CABs, that the county administrative boards that really need to work together to get all those quality things like the climate change addressing the climate change issues, to really get the connectivity and coherence going, and this large perspective when we need to scale up to 30% and work with 10% strict protection. It's not so practical to work with all. I think we have 14 coastal county administrative boards, and working with those larger pieces makes it so more easy, and the collaboration is crucial to get the coherent network. If we only look at that part and representativity, we tried to build this structure to be able to scale it up and down, to have the same structure for one MPA or for all the MPAs within one county or the Baltic proper, and also to scale it up to the national level or even the Baltic Sea and so on. So we try to really have the framework to make it useful at different scales and levels. But I think having those larger pieces of the puzzle within Sweden has made it so much easier and to get this collaboration going.
Great, thank you very much. We have a couple of more minutes. I don't see any questions coming in so far, but do please feel free to share in the chat what you thought was the main takeaway, the main thing you walk away with from this webinar. And we will stay on also for a couple of minutes here in case there are any more questions coming in. Meanwhile, as a reminder, we will walk through the same agenda again next Thursday. So if there was something that you would like to hear repeated, please feel free to register for that session as well. You can find more information in the report. I will put the links in the chat in a second. And again, towards the end of November, after the last webinar, we will email you a link to the recording so you can watch it back. And do also feel free to spread the word to anyone who you think might find this useful. So I'll share those links in the chat now. We hope this has been useful and inspiring to everyone. Thank you to all our panelists for a great job. Thank you so much to everyone from across the world for joining us and for actively participating with questions and comments. Please do reach out if you'd like to discuss more. We will close here. Please feel free to drop off or stay online to ask a final question and hear the answers. Thank you, everyone.